What's one of the marks of the totalitarianisms of the 20th century? A strict censorship of ideas, a strict limitation on what could be said or written publicly. How come? How come? Because any appeal to the objectivity of truth and value is a threat to tyrants. I'm currently making my way through D.C. Schindler's wonderful book called The Politics of the Real. For anyone interested in the relation between religion and politics, it's a marvelous, very rich book. But I want to draw attention to the epigram that he chose really for his entire book, a kind of motto that's meant, I think, to haunt the mind of the reader as he or she makes their way through the various arguments. And I'll confess it haunted my mind. It stayed very much in my imagination. It's a quote from the 20th century philosopher, the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, whom I've admired for a long time, her great book, The Human Condition. But she's probably best known for her meditations on the issue of totalitarianism, especially as it manifested itself in the 20th century. So here's the quote. I want to read it to you, and I want this now to sink in. She said, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, that is the reality of experience, and the distinction between the true and the false, that is standards of thought, no longer exist." Okay, who's the subject of totalitarianism? Don't look right away to the convinced Nazi or communist, but rather to people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the distinction between the true and the false, have evanesced. They've ceased to exist. Now, why should this be true? Well, think about totalitarianism for a second. You might define it as the dominating control of all aspects of life by the will, the arbitrary will of an individual or a group. It's the dominance of the entire society. It's the imposition of an authority of a group or individuals on the whole of society. In classical philosophy, the true and the good, in their objectivity, have a kind of intrinsic authority. They command the attention of the mind and the will. They, if you want, impose themselves on the receptive mind and the receptive will. Think, for example, of someone discovering a great mathematical truth, or being convinced by a philosophical argument, or taking in clear scientific data. What's happening? Well, the mind isn't inventing its own truth. Rather, it's accepting the authority of the objective truth, which is imposing itself, mind you, in a liberating way upon the receptive mind. Or consider ethical and moral values. When the ethically good, an objective moral value, appears before the will rejoices in its acquiescence to the authority of that objective good. The will is not imposing itself. It's not inventing its own values. It's accepting the authority of the objectivity of the good. Now, I've talked a lot about this. I think the primary problem in our culture today in the West is what I've called this culture of self-invention. Our tendency now to say, no, don't impose any truth or value on me. Don't appeal to objectivities. Rather, in the depth of my freedom, I invent my own truths. My mind makes up their own truth. My will invents moral value. And you say, well, that's good, isn't it? It's sort of tolerant, and it respects people's integrity, and it gives them their own proper authority. In point of fact, everybody, this is an enslaving move. This is a finally denigrating move. Our culture believes, if I can borrow from that famous movie title, in the shape of water. In other words, it has no shape except the one that I impose upon it. What's being denied there, do you see, is the authority of the objectively true and the objectively valuable. Now, why should this worry us so much? Well, because as Hannah Arendt intuited long ago, it opens the door toward totalitarianism. Why? Well, if the objectively true and good have evanesced, they've disappeared. There's no objective criterion to which we can appeal together, to which together we can submit ourselves. All that's left is the struggle of will against will. Am I right? I mean, look anywhere in the culture today and you'll see evidence of it. What we're left with is, well, look, I got my truth, you got your truth. No, this is my value, that's your value. We'll tolerate each other, but what's going to happen is, since no appeal to the objective is possible, the wills will clash inevitably. And at the end, what? The most powerful will assert itself. Now, go right back, if you want, to the 19th century and Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most important philosophers who is influencing our culture today. What do you find? The Übermensch, the Superman, expressing his great will to power. That's the fundamental thing. Don't give me these objective truths and moral values. No, I invent my values. I invent my truths. And it's the one who has the greatest will to power who will emerge. I wonder if any of that sounds familiar. Look at the 20th century, when some of the worst totalitarianisms in human history obtained. Notice something too, please. What's one of the marks of the totalitarianisms of the 20th century? A strict censorship of ideas, a strict limitation in what could be said or written publicly. How come? How come? Because any appeal to the objectivity of truth and value is a threat to tyrants. It always has been. Whenever you appeal to an authority outside the will of the most powerful, you are limiting that totalitarian instinct. So of course, these governments have imposed strict limitations on speech. I wonder if any of that sounds a little bit familiar in our culture today. Can I draw attention finally to a hero of mine from the 20th century, the great Václav Havel. You know, Václav Havel, who was a Czech poet and writer, a playwright, literary figure, who in the depth of the Soviet dominance of his home country, when he was living under a totalitarian society, began to write truths about the human condition, write against the oppression of the Soviet system. He was imprisoned, you bet, many times. Time and again, he and his friends were thrown in jail, limited, they couldn't speak, couldn't write. But Havel said, once the Soviet Union collapsed and once he had found some political freedom, he said what happened was, every time he wrote the truth, he opened up a space for the truth. And then into that space, more could come, and that made the space bigger. And then more could enter it and made the space bigger. And before you knew it, he said, that space was so big that the totalitarian society could no longer endure. I want you to notice something too. He didn't say, I opened up a space for my personal opinion. I mean, bore me to death with that. You hear it in every aspect of our culture today. I'm doing it, it's my will, it's my freedom. Yeah, but what if my freedom is all misguided? What if my mind is all off kilter? What matters is not my little puny will and self-assertion. What matters is the truth. And Havel said, in speaking the truth, he opened up a space for truth. You want to see the best example of this? John Paul II, 1979, Victory Square in Warsaw. He's got the Polish government behind him, which is under the thumb of the totalitarian dictatorship in Moscow. And John Paul began speaking the truth about God and about human beings and about our freedom and about creation and about salvation. And remember, the people famously began to shout, we want God, we want God, we want God. And on it went for 15 minutes. What did he do at that moment? He opened up a space for truth into which about 1 million people came. And that was, by any account, the beginning of the end of the Soviet totalitarian dictatorship. It's when we bracket the objectivity of the true and the good, when we can no longer make those distinctions, we no longer care about the difference between fact and fiction, truth and falsity, that's when the door opens for totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt knew it long ago. I do fear, everybody, that as our culture sort of lurches in that direction, away from the authority of the true and the good and toward the supreme authority of the individual will, it puts ourselves in a rather parlous condition. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.